The dust choked the air, painting the late afternoon sun in a sickly amber hue over the vast plains of Montana. Jedediah, Jed Stone, a man carved from the very rock of the land he owned, rode with a silent purpose. His face, etched with a perpetual sternness, was as unyielding as the mountains on the horizon. His ranch, a sprawling empire of grit and hard labor, was his sole companion, and his name commanded a respect born of fear and grudging admiration. Jed was tracking a rogue wolf he'd heard was preying on his cattle. He found a half-eaten calf near the dry creek bed, its bones picked clean. The sight hardened his resolve. A single, distinct howl echoed from the high ridge, a mournful, almost human sound that made his horse, a sturdy bay named Samson, shift nervously. It wasn't the guttural call of a predator, but something far more unsettling. He dismounted, his rifle held loosely in his hand, and began to climb. He crested the ridge, the wind whipping at his duster. The sound came again, a long, sorrowful wail that tore at the silence. But it wasn't a wolf. It was a girl, huddled against a rock formation, her ragged clothes little more than tattered remnants clinging to her gaunt frame. Her hair, a tangled mass of dark knots, was caked with dirt. Her eyes, wide and wild, were fixed on him, filled with a primal terror he hadn't expected. She was thin, starved, with visible bruises mottling her pale skin. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but all that came out was that strange animal-like howl. She whimpered, a low guttural sound, and scrambled backwards, trying to melt into the shadows of the rocks. Jed's first instinct was to turn away, to leave this broken creature to her fate. This wasn't his problem. The ranch was his only concern, and this girl was a complication he neither wanted nor needed. But something in her eyes, a spark of defiance beneath the fear, held him. He lowered his rifle, the cold steel no longer a weapon, but a barrier between them. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble. He spoke as he would to a skittish horse, without threat, but with a quiet authority. "I ain't gonna hurt you." She didn't respond, just watched him with those feral eyes. He saw the marks of a struggle on her, and a fresh gash on her arm wept a slow trail of blood. She was bleeding, and the sight of it stirred a memory he had long buried. A memory of a young girl, his own sister, left to fend for herself, and the guilt that had festered in his gut ever since. He took a hesitant step forward. "You're hurt," he said, his voice softer now. He pulled out a clean handkerchief from his pocket, a small square of white against the dust of the land. "Let me see that." She recoiled, her body trembling violently. She bared her teeth in a silent snarl, a desperate, futile attempt to appear menacing. He saw the sheer, unadulterated fear in her eyes and realized that the trauma she had endured was far deeper than the physical wounds. He backed away, giving her space, a gesture of peace in a world she likely knew nothing of. "All right, I'm just going to leave this here," he said, placing the handkerchief on a flat rock a few feet away. "It's clean. You can use it." He turned, his back to her, a gesture of trust that was entirely uncharacteristic of him. He walked slowly back to Samson, giving her the chance to disappear if she wanted to. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of the wind. He mounted his horse and looked back. She hadn't moved. She was still huddled against the rock, watching him, a small lost ghost on the ridge. He couldn't just leave her. The thought gnawed at him, a splinter under his skin. It was against every rule he lived by, every principle of self-preservation he had built his life on. But the image of her, broken and terrified, was a weight on his conscience. He spurred Samson forward, but instead of riding away, he circled back, approaching her from a different angle, slowly, deliberately. This time he didn't dismount. He stayed in the saddle, a towering silhouette against the setting sun. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen and a piece of dried jerky. He placed them on the ground near the handkerchief, careful not to get too close. "Water. And something to eat," he said simply. She didn't move. He waited. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. The air was turning cold. He couldn't force her, but he couldn't leave her to die of exposure either. He felt a rare, unfamiliar surge of helplessness. He was a man who solved problems, who bent the world to his will, but this was a problem of a different kind. He was about to ride away when she moved. She uncurled her emaciated body, her movements slow and deliberate like a starved animal. She crawled to the items he had left, her wild eyes never leaving him. She picked up the jerky, her fingers trembling, and brought it to her mouth, chewing slowly, savoring the taste. She then drank greedily from the canteen, the water spilling down her chin. The sight of her, so desperate and so broken, sealed his decision. He couldn't, in good conscience, leave her here. He had to help her. Even if it was the last thing he ever wanted to do, he would take her back to the ranch. It was a fool's errand, he knew. His men would question his sanity, and she would be a burden, a constant reminder of the world's cruelty and his own weakness. But as he watched her, a fragile, trembling creature illuminated by the last vestiges of daylight, he knew he had no other choice. He would take her back. He just didn't know how yet. He'd deal with that when he got there. He had to. For some reason, he just had to. Jed didn't try to get her to come with him. He knew better than to push a cornered animal. Instead, he rode a short distance away and made a fire as night fell, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rocky outcrop. He sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, and waited. He watched her from a distance, a small, hunched figure, her eyes glowing in the firelight. He saw her shiver, the cold of the mountain air seeping into her thin clothes. He knew she wouldn't come near him. He was a stranger, a man who, for all she knew, could be a new source of pain. So he waited. He let the silence speak for him, a testament to his patience. He was a rancher, accustomed to the slow, steady rhythm of the land. He knew that some things couldn't be rushed. Hours passed. The moon rose, a pale sliver in the dark sky. The stars, a million pinpricks of light, glittered above. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a real wolf. She was still there, a statue of fear and exhaustion. Finally she moved. Her movements were slow, a long-ago practiced stealth. She crept towards the fire, staying just at the edge of the light, her eyes on him. She sat on the cold ground, her knees drawn to her chest, her thin arms wrapped around them. She was still shivering, but the fire offered a small measure of warmth. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his gaze unwavering but not threatening. He pulled out a second piece of jerky, a larger one this time, and tossed it gently towards her. It landed a few feet away, a small offering. She eyed it, then him, her gaze a mixture of suspicion and desperate hunger. She finally reached out, her hand trembling, and took it. She ate it in small, deliberate bites, as if afraid it would disappear. He saw the cuts on her knuckles, the dirt caked under her nails, the bruises on her neck. It was clear she had been through a lot. The thought of what she must have endured, alone in this unforgiving landscape, sent a cold shiver down his spine. He wondered what kind of people would do this to a girl, what kind of life she had lived to be so broken. He couldn't help but think of the rumors he'd heard in the nearest town, whispers about a group of nomadic outlaws who had been passing through the territory, known for their cruelty. He didn't know if they were responsible, but the thought lingered, a dark shadow in his mind. He decided to try speaking again. "My name's Jedediah Stone. People call me Jed." She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the fire. He didn't push it. He just let his words hang in the air, a small bridge between them. He realized then that she might not be able to speak. The strange howls, the lack of response, it all pointed to a deeper trauma, something that had stolen her voice and replaced it with a primal form of communication. He let the conversation drop. He knew he was taking a risk bringing her back to the ranch. His men, a rough-and-tumble crew of hardened cowboys, would not be pleased. They were practical men, focused on the bottom line. A broken girl would be seen as a liability, a weakness. They wouldn't understand. They would mock her, and they would question his judgment. But he had to do it. He waited until she had finally fallen asleep, her body a small, tired lump near the fire. He rose slowly, making sure not to startle her. He walked to Samson, pulled a blanket from his saddlebag, and gently laid it over her. She didn't stir. The trust was there, fragile and new, but it was there. The next morning, the first rays of the sun painted the sky in a soft golden light. Jed woke to the sight of her, her face turned towards the sun, a peaceful expression on her face. She was still asleep, curled into a ball under the blanket. He let her sleep, making a small breakfast for himself, and silently offered her a piece of his hardtack. When she woke, she was startled to see him so close, but she didn't run. She looked at the food, then at him, a question in her eyes. He simply nodded towards it, a silent invitation. She ate it slowly, a small smile, almost imperceptible, playing on her lips. It was the first sign of anything other than fear and exhaustion he had seen from her, and it was a moment he would carry with him. He knew this was the time to try. He walked to her slowly, deliberately, his movements non-threatening. He knelt down, his eyes level with hers. "I'm going back to the ranch," he said, his voice low and calm. "You can come with me. It's warm there, and there's food." She just stared at him, her eyes unreadable. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was the moment of truth. He couldn't force her. It had to be her choice. He extended his hand, an offering of peace, of safety. She looked at his hand, then at his face, then back at his hand. The silence stretched, a palpable thing between them. Finally, she made a decision. She reached out, her small, trembling hand meeting his large, calloused one. Her grip was fragile, but firm. A silent agreement was made. Jed knew then that this was not just a rescue, it was a pact. He would protect her, and she would have to trust him. It was the beginning of something new, something that would change both of their lives forever. He gently helped her to her feet, and together they began the long journey back to the ranch, a journey that would be fraught with danger and conflict, but also with the promise of a new beginning. The sight of Jedediah Stone riding back to his ranch with a ragged girl in tow sent a ripple of bewilderment through his men. They watched from the corrals, their faces a mixture of confusion and open mockery. Jed was a man of cold logic and hard efficiency. This was neither. Jed dismounted, his gaze sweeping over his men, daring them to speak. Gus, his foreman, a gruff, weathered man with a handlebar mustache, was the first to approach. "Jed," he said, his voice low and cautious. "Who's the girl?" Jed's jaw tightened. He didn't like to be questioned. "She's just a stray I found on the North Ridge," he said, his tone final. "She's hurt. She'll be staying here for a while." A sneer spread across the face of Silas, a lanky, sharp-tongued cowhand who had always harbored a secret resentment for Jed's success. "A stray, Jed? Looks more like a wild animal. I heard her howling like a wolf." The other men snickered, the sound a sharp, ugly thing in the quiet afternoon air. The girl who Jed had learned was named Elara through a note he found hidden in her clothes, flinched at the sound, her hands clenching into fists. She looked at Jed, her eyes wide with fear, as if expecting him to turn on her, to join in the mockery. But Jed just looked at her, his gaze a silent promise. Jed's voice was a low growl, a warning. "I suggest you watch your mouth, Silas. She's under my protection now." Silas wasn't one to back down. "Protection? Jed, we're a ranch, not a hospice. She's a burden. What good is she to us?" "She's a human being, Silas," Jed said, his voice rising, the low thunder of his fury now apparent. "And she's my responsibility. If I find any of you bothering her or making her feel unwelcome, you'll be out on your ear so fast your boots won't even touch the ground." The men fell silent, the weight of Jed's threat heavy in the air. They knew he wasn't a man who made idle threats. He was a man of his word, and his word was law on this ranch. Silas, though, couldn't resist one last whispered jibe. "A wild animal on the ranch, Jed. You're losing your touch." Jed's face turned to stone. He took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist. Gus, seeing the danger, quickly stepped in between them. "That's enough, Silas. Get back to work." Silas glared at Jed, then at the girl, a look of pure malevolence in his eyes. He slowly backed away, but the message was clear. Elara was an outsider, a threat to their established order, and they would not accept her. Jed turned his back on the men and gently took Elara's arm. He led her to the small, empty cabin he kept for visiting guests. "This is yours," he said, his voice soft, a stark contrast to the anger he had just displayed. "It's not much, but it's clean." Elara walked inside, her eyes scanning the small space. There was a single bed, a small table, and a wash basin. It was more than she had had in a long time. She sat on the edge of the bed, her body still and tense. She looked at him, a silent question in her eyes. Why? He didn't have an answer for her, not one that made sense anyway. "You were hurt," he said, the words feeling inadequate, "and you needed help." He left her there, knowing she needed space and time to herself. He went to the main house, a large log cabin that was both his office and his home. He sat at his desk, the silence of the room a welcome change from the tension outside. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He was a man who had built an empire on a simple principle. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had no time for sentiment, for weakness. He had seen what it did to people, how it left them vulnerable. But now, with Elara, he had broken his own rule. He had brought a wounded, vulnerable girl into a world of hardened, practical men. He knew it would cause trouble, but he also knew he couldn't have done anything else. He pulled out a map of his land, his mind going back to his initial plan. He needed to find out who had hurt her, who had left her for dead. He knew it wouldn't be easy. People in these parts didn't take kindly to outsiders poking their noses into their business. But he had to. He had to know. For her. And for himself. The anger at Silas's mockery still simmered beneath the surface. He would show them. He would prove them all wrong. He would help her. And in doing so, he would protect the one thing he had inadvertently brought into his life. A fragile hope for a future different from the one he had always imagined for himself. He would protect Elara, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. It was a new and dangerous feeling, but he was prepared to fight for it. He would face his men's hostility, the dangers of the land and the ghosts of his own past. He would not fail her. He couldn't. The days that followed were a slow, tense dance of cautious trust and simmering hostility. Elara rarely left the small cabin Jed had given her. She was a ghost in her own right, seen only at mealtimes when Jed would bring her a plate of food. He would leave it by her door, and she would take it only after he had gone. Jed kept his word. He was a silent sentinel, a constant presence that was both a comfort and a source of unease. He didn't speak to her much, knowing she likely wouldn't respond. He just watched, a quiet, watchful protector. He saw the way she would flinch when one of his men passed by, the way she would retreat back into the shadows. He saw the way she would stare at him, her eyes a silent question. One evening, Jed found her sitting on the front steps of her cabin, the setting sun painting her face in a soft, warm light. He sat down beside her, not too close, just close enough to let her know he was there. The silence stretched between them, a comfortable, almost peaceful thing. He didn't try to fill it, he just sat, his presence a quiet comfort. He pulled out a small piece of wood and a whittling knife and began to carve. It was a simple, repetitive task that calmed his mind. He worked in silence, his strong, calloused hands moving with a surprising delicacy. He was carving a small bird, its wings spread as if in flight. Elara watched him, her eyes following the movements of his hands. She was fascinated, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She moved a little closer, her body still tense but her fear momentarily forgotten. "My pa taught me how to do this," Jed said, his voice a low, even tone. "Said a man should always have a way to keep his hands busy." She didn't respond, but she continued to watch. He finished the carving, a small, perfect bird, and offered it to her. She looked at it, then at him, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. He didn't push it. He just held it out. After a moment, she reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed against his, a brief electric moment of contact. She held the small bird in her palm, turning it over and over, a small, fragile thing in her hand. She looked at him, and for the first time she made a sound. It was a small, choked whisper, a single word. Jed. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the first time she had said his name, the first time she had spoken to him directly. "Yes," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. She looked at him, her eyes filled with an unspoken emotion. She held up the small bird. "Bird," she whispered, her voice a reedy, unused sound. "Yes," Jed said, a smile, a rare and genuine thing spreading across his face. "It's a bird." He realized then that her inability to speak wasn't because she couldn't. It was because she was afraid. She had been silenced by fear, by trauma. And now she was slowly, tentatively, beginning to find her voice again. It was a slow process, a careful, methodical one. He wasn't going to rush it. He would let her find her way. "My name is Elara," she said, her voice still a whisper, but it was stronger now. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "I found a note with your name on it." She nodded, a small, weary gesture. They took it," she said, her voice trembling. "My mother. They took everything." Jed's face hardened. "Who did?" She shook her head, her face a mask of terror. "I don't know. They were bad men. They took everything." He didn't push her. He knew the memories were too painful, too fresh. He just sat with her in the quiet of the evening, the small carved bird a silent symbol of their fragile connection. He knew then that the journey to her recovery would be a long one. It would not be easy, but he was in it for the long haul. That night, for the first time since she had arrived, she slept without the haunting fear that had been her constant companion. She slept with the small carved bird in her hand, a small tangible piece of safety, in a world that had until now offered her none. Jed, meanwhile, sat up late, his mind racing. He had a name that could lead him to the men who had hurt her. He knew it was dangerous, but he was willing to take the risk. He would find them, for Elara, for the little girl who had found her voice and her name again, and for the silent promise he had made to her on a dusty ridge. The fragile peace of the ranch was shattered by a growing undercurrent of resentment. Silas and a few of his more impressionable cronies, men named Jeb and Tom, saw Elara as a sign of Jed's weakness. They saw her as a drain on their resources, a mouth to feed that provided no labor in return. Their hostility was a palpable thing, a low, simmering tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jed, ever watchful, noticed the sidelong glances and whispered comments. He heard the thinly veiled insults, the way they would deliberately ignore her or speak in hushed tones whenever she was near. He knew he had to act. He couldn't let this fester. One morning, he found Silas and Jeb leaning against a fence, watching Elara as she fed the chickens. Silas's mouth was a cruel line. "Look at her," he sneered, still howling at the moon, even in the daytime. Jeb snickered. Jed walked up to them, his boots making no sound in the dust. "Something you want to say, Silas?" Silas's sneer didn't falter. "Just wondering what the little wildcat does for a living, Jed. You're running a ranch, not a charity." Jed's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "She's a guest in my home, and I suggest you remember that." "A guest?" Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "She's a damn burden. We're not a nursery, Jed." Jed's hand shot out, grabbing Silas by the collar of his shirt and slamming him against the fence. The force of the impact was enough to rattle his teeth. "You will not speak to me like that. You will not speak about her like that. You will show her the same respect you show me." Silas, his face pale with shock, just stared at him. Jed's fury was a raw, unfiltered thing, a side of him the men rarely saw. It was a quiet fury, a chillingly cold one, more terrifying than any loud outburst. "I run this ranch," Jed said, his voice a whisper, but one that carried the weight of a thunderclap. "My word is law. If you can't abide by that, you can ride out of here right now. There's plenty of men out there looking for a job." Jeb, seeing the look in Jed's eyes, nervously backed away. Silas, his pride wounded, just glared at him, his face a mask of bitter resentment. "You'll regret this, Jed," he whispered. "You're a fool for bringing a stray dog into your home." Jed released him, his grip leaving a mark on Silas's neck. "Get to work, Silas, all of you." The men scattered, the tension still thick in the air. Elara, who had been watching from a distance, came to Jed. Her face was a mixture of fear and a fragile, new emotion, gratitude. She looked at the bruises on Jed's knuckles, a result of his grip on Silas. She reached out and gently touched his hand, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing. He flinched at her touch, but didn't pull away. He looked at her, and the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface was replaced by a quiet, protective tenderness. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than he had intended. She nodded. You fought for me," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "Thank you." He shook his head. "It's what I do. I protect what's mine." The words slipped out without him thinking. He saw the way her eyes widened, and he realized he had said too much. He hadn't meant it as a possessive statement, but it came out that way. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the old fear returning. He had to reassure her. "I mean," he said, stumbling over his words, a rare occurrence for him. "I mean, you're a part of this ranch now, and I protect my own." She didn't respond, just looked at him, her eyes searching his. She finally nodded, a small, fragile smile on her face. The trust was there, new and a little shaky, but it was there. Jed watched her walk back to her cabin. He knew he had to be careful. The men's resentment was a dangerous thing, a silent poison that could destroy everything he had built. He knew that Silas, in particular, was a threat. He was not a man to forget an insult. He would get his revenge. Jed had to be ready. He had to be prepared for the inevitable confrontation that was coming. He had to protect Elara, not just from the outside world, but from the insidious evil that was now lurking on his own land. He had to make her feel safe, even as he was preparing for a war. The days on the ranch were long, punctuated by the rhythm of sunrises and sunsets, the lowing of cattle, and the creak of leather. Jed found himself drawn to Elara's small cabin in the evenings. He would sit on the porch, his rifle across his lap, just a quiet presence, a watchful shadow in the darkness. He didn't speak, but his presence was a reassurance. One evening he brought her a small, well-worn book. It was a collection of stories, simple tales of adventure and courage. "I found it in the house," he said, his voice low. "It was my mother's." Elara's eyes lit up. She took the book, her fingers tracing the faded gold letters on the cover. "Stories?" she whispered. "Yes," Jed said. "My ma used to read them to me." She looked at him, a silent question in her eyes. Can you read one to me?" Jed's face stiffened. He hadn't read a story aloud in years. He was a man of action, not of words, but he saw the hope in her eyes, and he couldn't deny her. He took the book and opened it to the first page. His voice, rough and unused to the rhythm of storytelling, was a little shaky at first, but as he read, it settled into a low, comforting rumble. He read a story about a little girl who got lost in a forest, but who was found by a family of kind bears. It was a simple, childlike tale, but as he read, he saw the tension in Elara's shoulders begin to ease. She leaned her head against the wall of the cabin, her eyes closed, listening to the sound of his voice, the simple, comforting rhythm of the words. When he finished, she didn't say anything. She just opened her eyes and looked at him. "Thank you," she whispered. He just nodded. "I'll read to you again tomorrow," he said, and he meant it. It was a small thing, but he knew it was important. He knew that the stories were a way for her to escape, to heal, to find her way back to the world she had been stolen from. The next day, she emerged from her cabin with a purpose. She went to the chicken coop and began to feed the chickens. Her movements hesitant at first, but soon gaining a practiced ease. She had been watching the other men, learning from a distance. Jed watched her from a distance, a small, proud smile on his face. She was not just a survivor, she was a learner. She was healing slowly but surely. He saw the way the men reacted. They still saw her as a strange, wild thing, but they were also beginning to see her as a presence, a small, quiet part of the ranch's ecosystem. Silas still muttered insults under his breath, but they were less frequent, less venomous. He was losing his hold on the other men who were beginning to see the girl as a person, not a burden. Jed knew that the real challenge was still to come. He knew that he couldn't protect her forever. He had to help her find her own strength, her own voice. He had to help her fight her own battles, and he had to be ready for the moment when the past would come looking for her. He knew it would. A girl who could survive on her own in the wilderness for so long, a girl with such a deep-seated fear of others, a girl with a missing family. There was a reason she was out there, alone, and he was going to find out what it was. He knew his decision to take her in had been a dangerous one. He knew it would bring trouble to his doorstep. But as he watched her, her small, fragile figure, a beacon of quiet resilience in the vast, unforgiving landscape, he knew he wouldn't have had it any other way. Jed's fears were realized sooner than he expected. A rider came to the ranch, a lean, dusty man with a cold, predatory look in his eyes. He introduced himself as a bounty hunter, and his name was Elias Thorne. Jed's gut instinct told him to be wary. Elias was looking for a girl. He had a wanted poster in his saddlebag and a detailed description of her. "She's a runaway," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "Stole a considerable amount of money from her family. They want her back." Jed's heart sank. He knew this was a lie. He had seen the terror in Elara's eyes, the bruises on her skin. She was not a thief. She was a victim. But he couldn't say that. He couldn't reveal her. He had to protect her. He looked at the poster. It was a crude drawing, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The description was vague, but it was enough. "I haven't seen anyone like that," Jed said, his voice steady. "This is a big country." Elias's eyes narrowed. He looked around the ranch, his gaze lingering on the small cabin where Elara was. "This is a big country," he said, a mocking tone in his voice, "but she's a small woman. She can't have gotten far." Jed's hand rested on the butt of his pistol. "I said I haven't seen her." Elias just smiled, a chilling, humorless thing. "I heard you took in a stray, Jed, a little girl who howls at the moon." Jed's blood ran cold. The man was a monster. He knew it. He had heard the rumors, the stories of bounty hunters who would stop at nothing to get their quarry. This man was one of them. "You heard wrong," Jed said, his voice a low growl. "I don't know who you're talking about." Elias just laughed. "We'll see about that, Jed. We'll see about that." He rode away, but Jed knew he wasn't gone for good. He was just biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jed went to Elara's cabin. He found her inside, mending a tear in her shirt with a small needle and thread. She looked up at him, her face a question. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now. "You look angry." Jed's face was grim. "Trouble," he said simply. "A man came looking for you." Her face went pale. The terror he had seen on the ridge was back, a ghost from her past. He found me?" she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy sound. "He found me again?" "He didn't find you," Jed said, his voice a calm reassurance. "I told him I hadn't seen you, but he'll be back." Her hands trembled. She dropped the needle, the small, sharp thing clattering on the floor. I have to go," she said, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "I can't stay here. He'll hurt you. He'll hurt all of you." Jed knelt down, taking her hands in his. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm. "I promised I'd protect you, and I will." But he's with them," she whispered, her eyes wide with a deep-seated fear. They're all coming back." Jed's heart pounded in his chest. "Who are they, Elara? Tell me." She shook her head, her face a mask of terror. "I can't. He'll hurt me." Jed knew he couldn't push her. The trauma was too deep. But he also knew he had to be ready. He had to prepare his men, to prepare himself. He had to be ready for a fight. He would not let them take her. Not now, not ever. He would face a bounty hunter, a whole gang of them if he had to. He would protect her, not because it was his job, but because she was his. He had said the words before, and now he knew they were true. She was his to protect, his to care for, his to fight for. And he would. Jed spent the next few days in a state of quiet vigilance. He rode the perimeter of his land, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Elias or the men he was with. He kept his rifle close at hand, and he instructed his men to be on high alert. Gus, his foreman, saw the seriousness in Jed's face, and he knew something was wrong. "Jed," Gus said one evening, "what's going on? You're jumpier than a cat on a hot tin roof." Jed hesitated. He didn't want to get his men involved, but he knew he couldn't do this alone. He trusted Gus. He had to tell him. "A man came here looking for Elara," he said, his voice low. "A bounty hunter. He wants to take her back." Gus's face hardened. He had seen the way Elara had been slowly healing, the way she had started to come out of her shell. He had seen the quiet, protective way Jed had been with her. He knew this was not a simple runaway. "What for?" "He said she was a runaway and a thief," Jed said. "But he was lying. I think they're the ones who hurt her, the ones who took her family." Gus's jaw tightened. He had a daughter of his own, a young girl named Lily, who lived in a nearby town with her mother. The thought of someone hurting a child, a girl like Elara, filled him with a cold rage. "What do we do?" "We wait," Jed said, "and we get ready. We'll set a watch. We'll make sure they don't get near her." Gus nodded. "Silas won't be happy about this." Jed just shrugged. "I don't care what Silas thinks. If he can't get on board, he can ride out of here." Gus went to his men, and he explained the situation in a way that Jed couldn't. He didn't tell them the whole story, just that a bounty hunter was on the loose, and that they had to be on the lookout. He made it clear that Jed's authority was not to be questioned. The men, who had a grudging respect for Jed, knew that his word was law. They set up a watch, and they were on high alert, their hands on their guns, their eyes on the horizon. Elara, meanwhile, felt a growing sense of dread. She had heard the men talking in hushed tones. She had seen the way they were on edge. She knew it was because of her. She couldn't shake the feeling of being a burden, of being a danger to these people who had so unexpectedly offered her a home. She went to Jed that evening. He was sitting on the porch, his face etched with a silent worry. "Jed," she said, her voice a little shaky, "you have to let me go. I can't let you get hurt because of me." Jed looked at her, his eyes unwavering. "I made a promise, Elara. I'm not breaking it. But they're dangerous," she said, her voice a whisper. "They'll hurt you." "I can handle myself," Jed said, his voice firm. "And you're not a burden. You're a part of this ranch now, a part of my life. I'm not letting them take you away from me." He said the words, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of his promise. She saw the quiet strength, the unyielding determination, the unwavering loyalty. He was not just a man who had found a stray. He was a man who had made a decision, a vow, and he was not going to break it. She looked at him and she knew she was safe, not just from the men outside, but from the ghosts inside her head. He had given her a place to be, a person to be, and a reason to be. He had given her a home and a future. She was no longer the broken, howling girl on the ridge. She was Elara, and she was under the protection of Jedediah Stone. The attack came in the dead of night, a silent, creeping thing that was more terrifying than any loud charge. Jed, who had been on watch, saw them first. 3 riders, silhouettes against the pale moon, their movements slow and deliberate. Elias was in the lead. Jed sounded the alarm, a single sharp whistle that cut through the silence. The men who had been on high alert were up and armed in an instant. They took their positions, their rifles trained on the approaching figures. Jed went to Elara's cabin. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Don't come out no matter what." She nodded, her face pale with fear. She watched from the window as the riders approached, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw Jed, a lone figure standing in the middle of the ranch, his rifle held high. He was a symbol of defiance, a wall of flesh and bone against the coming storm. Elias stopped his horse a few yards away, his face a grim, predatory mask. "Jedediah Stone," he said, his voice a mocking thing. "You're a fool. You can't stand against us. Just hand over the girl, and we'll be on our way." "She's not here," Jed said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And if you don't turn back now, you're not leaving here alive." Elias just laughed. "We both know that's not true, Jed. She's here. I can smell the fear on her." Jed's gaze hardened. "I'm not a man who makes idle threats, Elias. Now ride out." Elias just smiled, a chilling, humorless thing. He dismounted and his 2 men followed suit. "You're a brave man, Jed," he said. "But you're a dead one." Jed raised his rifle. "Last chance." Elias just shook his head. "Get her," he said to his men. The 2 men charged, their movements a blur in the moonlight. Jed fired, the shot echoing through the quiet night. One of the men went down, a silent heap on the ground. The other kept coming. Jed fired again, and the man fell. Elias, meanwhile, had drawn his pistol. He fired, the shot whizzing past Jed's head. Jed returned fire, and the 2 men were locked in a deadly, silent dance, a ballet of bullets and death. Inside the cabin, Elara watched, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle a scream. She saw Jed, a towering figure of defiance, fighting for her. She knew she couldn't just stand by. She had to do something. She looked around the cabin, her eyes falling on the fireplace poker. It was a heavy iron thing, a crude but effective weapon. She grabbed it, her hands trembling, and she ran out of the cabin, a silent, determined wraith in the darkness. She saw Elias, his pistol trained on Jed, his finger on the trigger. Jed was out of bullets. He was a sitting duck. Elias was about to shoot. Elara knew she had to act. She ran towards Elias, her feet making no sound in the dust. She raised the poker, and she brought it down on Elias's head with all her might. The sound of the impact was a sickening thud. Elias fell to the ground, his pistol clattering to the ground. Jed, who had been bracing himself for the impact of a bullet, stared at her, his eyes wide with shock. He had never expected her to come out, to fight for him. He had always been the protector, the strong one, but she had been the brave one, the one who had saved his life. He looked at her, her small, frail figure illuminated by the pale moonlight, the heavy poker clutched in her hands. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior. She was a survivor. She was a fighter. And in that moment, as he looked at her, he knew he was not just protecting a stray. He was protecting a part of himself, a part he had long thought was gone. He would make sure she was safe. He would make sure no one, not Elias, not Silas, not anyone, would ever hurt her again. He had made a promise, and he would keep it. He would face the world, and he would fight for her, and he would not fail. The dust settled, and the silence that followed the gunshots was heavy and absolute. Jed stood over Elias, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elara, still clutching the fireplace poker, looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and a raw, untamed courage. The other men from the ranch, rifles lowered, gathered around, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and awe. Jed knelt beside Elias. The man was unconscious, a nasty gash bleeding from his temple. Jed checked for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady. He looked at Elara, her small frame trembling, her hands still gripping the makeshift weapon. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the man on the ground. She looked at his face, then at the blood on the ground, a silent, horrified acknowledgement of what she had done. Jed saw the terror in her eyes, the sudden realization of the gravity of her actions. He gently took the poker from her hands, his touch a silent reassurance. "It's all right," he said. "It's over now." Jed ordered his men to tie up Elias. The other 2 men were dead, their bodies silent and still in the dust. "Gus," Jed said, his voice flat, "bury them, far from the ranch. I don't want anyone to know they were here." Gus nodded grimly. He understood. This was a private war, a conflict that had to be contained. He and the other men got to work, their movements silent and efficient. Jed led Elara back to her cabin. She was still in a daze, her mind reeling. He sat her down on the bed, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the storm of her emotions. "You did a brave thing," he said. She just shook her head, her face pale. I hit him. I hit him and he fell. I could have killed him." "You did what you had to do," Jed said, his voice firm. "You protected me. You protected all of us." He saw her shudder, and he knew he had to get the truth from her. "Elara," he said, his voice soft. "Who are they? Why are they looking for you?" She looked at him, a silent conflict raging in her eyes. The terror of her past was a living thing, a shadow that clung to her. I can't," she whispered. He'll kill my mother. He'll kill my family." "Your family?" Jed's voice was sharp. "I thought you said they were gone." "They're not," she said, a tear rolling down her cheek. They're with them. The men who came for me. The men who took me." Jed's face hardened. A new wave of anger, a cold, burning rage swept over him. "Who are they, Elara? Tell me." She took a deep, shaky breath, and the words, a torrent of long-held secrets, came tumbling out. "They're a gang," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "They call themselves the Red Creek Raiders. They took my ma, they took my pa. They said they'd kill them if I didn't come back with them. I ran away." "Why did they take them?" Jed asked, his voice low. "My pa, he found something," she said, her voice shaking. "He found a map to a treasure. They said they would kill him if he didn't give it to them." Jed's mind reeled. A treasure map. It sounded like something out of a pulp novel, a ridiculous story. But he had seen the fear in her eyes, the raw, unfiltered terror. He knew she wasn't lying. "Where's the map now?" It's with them," she said, her voice a barely audible whisper. They have it." Jed ran a hand through his hair. The situation was more complicated and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He was no longer just protecting a lost girl. He was protecting a witness, a key to a secret that a group of dangerous outlaws was willing to kill for. "Elara," he said, his voice firm, "you're not going anywhere. You're staying here, and I'm going to get your family back." She looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. You would do that? For me?" "Yes," Jed said, his voice a quiet vow. "I would." He had no idea how he was going to do it. He was a rancher, not a bounty hunter. He had a ranch to run, men to manage, but he couldn't leave her, not now. He couldn't leave her alone with a past that was so close to catching up with her. He had to help her. He had to get her family back. He had to finish this. The next morning, Jed's ranch was a hive of activity. The men, now aware of the full scale of the danger, were no longer hostile. They were watchful, their movements efficient and deliberate. Gus, a man of few words, just nodded at Jed, a silent promise of loyalty and support. Even Silas, his face still bruised from the encounter, stayed quiet, his resentment replaced by a healthy dose of fear. Jed went to see Elias. The man was tied to a chair in the main barn, his head bandaged, his face a grimace of pain and hatred. Jed stood over him, a towering figure of authority. "Elias," he said, his voice flat. "You're going to tell me everything." Elias just sneered. "I don't know nothing, Jed. You're a fool. They're gonna come back. And when they do, they're going to finish what I started." Jed just shook his head. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're not, because you're going to tell me where they are. You're going to tell me where they're keeping her family." Elias just laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You'll never find 'em, Jed. They're long gone." Jed took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the man. "I'm a patient man, Elias, but I'm not a man to be trifled with. You're a long way from home, and I'm a long way from a town where a judge can question me. You're going to talk, or you're going to wish you had." Elias's bravado wavered. He saw the cold, unyielding resolve in Jed's eyes, and he knew Jed wasn't bluffing. He was a man who meant what he said. He sighed, a weary, defeated sound. "All right, Jed. All right, I'll talk." He told Jed everything. The Red Creek Raiders were a notorious gang, known for their ruthlessness and their love of gold. They had stumbled upon Elara's family, a quiet, nomadic family of prospectors, and they had found a map in their possession. A map to a lost Spanish treasure buried somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. They had taken the family hostage, and they had sent Elias to get Elara. "They're headed for the Black Mesa," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "It's an old fort. A good place to hide. They're waiting for the weather to clear before they make a move." Jed's mind raced. The Black Mesa. It was a treacherous, remote place, a fortress of rock and sand. It was a place where a man could get lost, and where a family could be held captive with no one the wiser. Jed looked at Elias, a sudden thought striking him. "Why did they send you?" he asked. "Why not the whole gang?" Elias just shrugged. "They didn't want to bring too much attention to themselves. They thought I was good enough to get a little girl." He looked at Elara, who was standing in the doorway listening to the conversation. "Looks like I was wrong." Jed left Elias tied up in the barn, his mind already racing with a plan. He went to the main house and pulled out a map of the territory. He traced a line from his ranch to the Black Mesa. It was a long journey, a dangerous one, a journey that would take him away from his home, from his business, from everything he had built. But he knew he had to go. He had made a promise. He had to get her family back. He would do it for Elara. He would do it for her family. He would do it for the quiet, fragile hope that had taken root in his heart. He would ride out, and he would face the Red Creek Raiders. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a protector. He was a guardian, and he would not fail. Jed called a meeting of his men. He told them everything about the Red Creek Raiders, the treasure map, Elara's family, and his plan to go to the Black Mesa. The men were a mix of emotions. Some were worried, some were excited, and some were openly hostile. Silas, ever the contrarian, was the first to speak. "Jed, this is madness," he said, his voice filled with a familiar resentment. "We're ranchers, not lawmen. This ain't our fight. We should just let 'em go. Let 'em have their treasure." Jed's gaze was cold and unwavering. "This is my fight, Silas. And since you're on my ranch, it's your fight too. I'm not letting a family die just because it's inconvenient." "But the ranch, Jed," Silas said, his voice rising in frustration. "Who's gonna run the ranch while you're gone? Who's gonna keep things in order?" "Gus will," Jed said, his voice flat. "He's in charge, and I expect you all to listen to him, and I expect you to take care of the ranch, and I expect you all to be here when I get back." Silas just shook his head. "I'm not going with you, Jed. This ain't my business." Jed just shrugged. "I'm not asking you to, Silas. But if you can't abide by my rules, you can ride out right now, and you can leave everything you own behind because you won't be coming back." Silas's face contorted with anger, but he knew Jed meant it. He had nowhere to go. He was stuck. He just glared at Jed, a look of pure malevolence in his eyes. Jed turned to the other men. "I'm not forcing any of you to come with me," he said. "This is a dangerous journey. A man could get killed. But I'm asking for a few good men to ride with me. Men who I can trust. Men who can watch my back." The men looked at each other. They were rough, hardened men, but they were also loyal. They had seen Jed's quiet courage, his unyielding resolve. They had seen the way he had protected Elara. They knew he was a good man, a just man, a man who would do the right thing even when it was the hard thing. Gus was the first to step forward. "I'm with you, Jed," he said, his voice firm. "Always have been. Always will be." A few more men followed. A young, eager hand named Billy, a quiet, stoic hand named Ben, and a seasoned veteran named Carl. 4 men, including Jed, against a ruthless gang. The odds were against them, but they were willing to take the risk. Jed looked at the 4 men, his heart swelling with a rare, unfamiliar feeling of gratitude. He wasn't alone. He had allies. He had men who would stand with him, no matter what. "All right," Jed said. "Get your gear ready. We ride at dawn." As the men dispersed, Elara came to Jed. She had been listening from the main house, her heart a tangled mess of hope and fear. "Jed," she said, her voice a little shaky, You're going for my family?" "Yes," Jed said, his voice firm. "I am." But it's dangerous," she said, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "You could get hurt." "I'll be fine," Jed said, a small, reassuring smile on his face. "I've faced worse than this." She just looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, silent gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Jed just nodded. He had no words. He just looked at her, this small, fragile girl who had so unexpectedly come into his life and changed everything. He knew he was doing the right thing. He had a family to rescue, a promise to keep, and a truth to find. He would ride out at dawn, and he would not stop until he had found her family and brought them back to her safe and sound. The morning sun cast long, silent shadows across the land as Jed, Gus, Billy, Ben, and Carl rode out. They were a small, determined group, their faces grim, their resolve unyielding. They were a testament to a different kind of courage, a quiet, unwavering bravery that was born of a deep sense of loyalty and a fierce love of justice. Jed led the way, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had a plan, a rough, desperate thing, but it was a plan nonetheless. He had to be smart. He couldn't just ride in guns blazing. He had to be a predator, not a victim. He had to outwit them, outmaneuver them and strike at their weakest point. The journey was long and arduous. They rode through unforgiving terrain, across vast, empty plains, and through treacherous, rocky canyons. The weather turned against them, a sudden, fierce storm lashing at them with cold rain and biting winds. They huddled together under a rocky overhang, the fire a small, flickering beacon of hope against the overwhelming darkness. Elara was not with them, of course. Jed had left her at the ranch, under the watchful eye of Gus's wife, a kind and gentle woman named Clara. Clara was a comforting presence, a woman who had a quiet, maternal warmth that Elara so desperately needed. She had taught Elara how to cook, how to sew, and she had listened to her stories, her heart breaking for the little girl who had endured so much. Jed thought about Elara often. He wondered how she was doing, if she was safe, if she was still afraid. He carried her small carved bird in his pocket, a small tangible reminder of the reason he was on this journey. It was a talisman of hope, a symbol of the fragile, precious thing he was fighting for. He also thought about the Red Creek raiders, the men who had hurt her, who had stolen her family. He thought about Elias, the cold, predatory look in his eyes, the casual cruelty in his voice. He thought about the map, the treasure, the gold that had caused so much pain. He knew that for them it was just a game of greed and power. But for him it was personal. It was a matter of honor, of justice, of a promise he had made, and a vow he intended to keep. The men were quiet, their thoughts their own. They were all experienced riders, men who knew the land, who understood the dangers. They trusted Jed. They trusted his judgment, his quiet courage, his unyielding resolve. They knew he wouldn't lead them into a fool's errand. They knew he would do what was right. One evening, as they sat around the campfire, Billy, the youngest of the group, spoke up. "Jed," he said, his voice a little shaky, "you really think we can do this? 5 of us, against a whole gang?" Jed looked at him, his gaze steady. "We're not going to fight them, Billy. We're going to outsmart them. We're going to hit them where they least expect it." "But what if we can't?" Billy asked, his voice filled with a desperate anxiety. "What if they're too strong? What if they kill us?" "Then we'll have died fighting for something that matters," Jed said, his voice firm. "We'll have died fighting for a good family, for an innocent girl, and that's a better way to die than any I know of." The men fell silent, their thoughts a whirlwind of fear and courage. They were on a long, dangerous journey, a journey into the heart of a conflict that was not their own. But they were with Jed, and they knew that no matter what happened, they were on the right side of the fight. They arrived at the Black Mesa 2 weeks later, their bodies weary, their spirits worn, but their resolve unwavering. The Black Mesa was a vast, desolate place, a fortress of rock and sand that rose from the flat plains like a jagged black tooth. It was a forbidding, hostile place, a perfect place for a gang of outlaws to hide. Jed and his men set up camp at a safe distance, their movements silent and deliberate. They spent the next few days scouting the area, their eyes trained on the mesa. They saw no signs of life, no movement, no smoke from a fire. It was as if the mesa was deserted, a silent, empty tomb. But Jed knew better. He knew they were there. He could feel it in the air, a silent, palpable tension that hung over the land like a shroud. He knew they were watching them, waiting for them to make a move. He had to be patient. He had to be smart. He had to wait for the right moment. One evening, as they were sitting around the campfire, Jed saw a flicker of light on the mesa. It was a signal, a coded message that was being sent from one part of the mesa to another. Jed, who had served as a scout in the war, knew how to read the signals. He watched them, his mind racing, trying to decipher the message. "They're not waiting for the weather to clear," Jed said, his voice low. "They're waiting for someone. Someone they're sending a message to." The men looked at him, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. "Who, Jed?" Gus asked. "Who are they waiting for?" "I don't know," Jed said, his voice grim. "But I think they're waiting for more men, more firepower. They're not just waiting for the weather to clear, they're waiting to ambush us." The men's faces went pale. They had been prepared for a fight, but they hadn't been prepared for an ambush. They were outmanned, outgunned, and outsmarted. Jed knew he had to act fast. He had to hit them now before their reinforcements arrived. He came up with a new plan, a daring, dangerous plan that relied on stealth and surprise. They would ride into the mesa at night, under the cover of darkness. They would find the fort and they would get Elara's family out. They would do it quietly, without a fight. They would be ghosts in the night, a silent, swift, and deadly force. The men listened to his plan, their faces grim, but they knew it was their only chance. They had come this far. They couldn't turn back now. They would face the darkness, they would face the danger, and they would face the Red Creek Raiders. They would do it for Elara. They would do it for her family. They would do it for the quiet, unyielding courage that Jed had shown them. The night was a cold, unforgiving thing, the moon a pale, silent sliver in the dark sky. Jed and his men rode into the mesa, their movements silent, their faces grim. They were a team, a well-oiled machine of loyalty and courage, their every movement a testament to their quiet, unwavering resolve. Jed led the way, his eyes scanning the darkness, his senses on high alert. He had a good sense of direction, a natural instinct for the land. He found the fort, a silent, dark fortress of rock and stone, a tomb of lost hopes and shattered dreams. The fort was a maze of narrow canyons and treacherous ledges, a perfect place for a gang of outlaws to hide. They dismounted, their movements silent, their boots making no sound in the dust. They moved like shadows, their bodies a part of the darkness. They found the entrance to the fort, a small hidden cave that led into the heart of the mesa. They entered, their senses on high alert, their hands on their guns. Inside, the fort was a living thing, a breathing, festering wound in the earth. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and stale sweat. They heard the low rumble of voices, the clink of glasses, the sound of laughter. The Red Creek Raiders were having a celebration, a victory party of sorts, a moment of weakness that Jed was ready to exploit. He and his men moved through the fort, their movements a silent ballet of stealth and precision. They found the prison, a small, dark cave at the back of the fort. They saw them, a man and a woman, their bodies gaunt and weary, their faces etched with a deep-seated fear. It was Elara's family. They were alive. Jed's heart swelled with a sudden, powerful wave of relief. He had come this far. He had faced the dangers of the land, the hostility of his men, the ghosts of his past, and he had found them. They were alive. They were safe. He and his men moved in, their movements a silent, deadly force. They disarmed the guards, their movements swift and silent, and they opened the cell door. Elara's parents, a man named Thomas and a woman named Sarah, looked at them, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "We're with Jedediah Stone," Gus whispered, his voice low. "We're here to get you out." The couple looked at each other, a flicker of hope in their eyes. "Elara?" Thomas whispered. Is she with you?" "She's safe," Jed said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "She's at my ranch. She's waiting for you." A tear rolled down Sarah's cheek. She just nodded, her face a mask of gratitude. They were alive. They were safe. They were going home. Jed and his men led the family out, their movements silent, their bodies a part of the darkness. They were a small, determined group, their hearts filled with a fierce, quiet courage. They had faced the darkness, they had faced the danger, and they had won. They had found the lost, and they had brought them home. The escape was a silent, desperate dash into the night. Jed and his men, along with Elara's parents, moved through the treacherous maze of the Black Mesa, their footsteps muffled by the dust. The gang was still celebrating, their drunken laughter echoing through the canyons, a cruel, mocking soundtrack to their desperate flight. Jed led the way, his instincts his only guide. He knew every turn, every treacherous ledge, every hidden crevice. He had memorized the map in his mind, and he was a ghost in the darkness, a silent, deadly guide. Gus, Ben, Billy, and Carl followed him, their faces grim, their rifles at the ready. Thomas and Sarah, their bodies weary and their spirits worn, were a silent, grateful presence. They trusted Jed completely. They had seen his quiet courage, his unyielding resolve, his fierce loyalty. They knew he was a man who would do what he said he would do. As they neared the edge of the mesa, they heard a sudden noise behind them, a loud, drunken yell, the sound of a gun being fired. The gang had found them. They had to move faster. Jed urged them on, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Faster," he said. "Faster now." They ran, their bodies a blur in the darkness. They reached their horses, a small, hidden patch of safety in the overwhelming darkness. They mounted, and they rode, their hearts pounding in their chests. The Red Creek Raiders were a silent, deadly force, their movements a blur in the darkness. They were a pack of wolves, a force of nature. Jed and his men were a small, fragile barrier against their overwhelming power. A shot whizzed past Jed's head, the sound a sharp, ugly thing in the quiet night. He turned, his rifle raised. He fired, and one of the riders fell, a silent, dark heap on the ground. He fired again, and another fell, but there were too many of them. Jed knew they couldn't fight them. They had to outrun them. He spurred his horse on, and the men followed. They were a small, determined group, their hearts filled with a fierce, quiet courage. They had faced the darkness, they had faced the danger, and they had won. They had found the lost, and they had brought them home. They rode through the night, a silent, desperate race against time. The Red Creek Raiders were a persistent, unyielding force, their horses thundering behind them like a force of nature. Jed knew they couldn't outrun them forever. They had to make a stand. He led his group to a small, hidden canyon, a narrow, treacherous place that was a natural fortress. He ordered his men to dismount, to take cover, to prepare for a fight. "This is it," he said, his voice grim. "We make our stand here." The men nodded, their faces grim, but their resolve unwavering. They were ready. They were prepared to fight, to die for what was right. The Red Creek Raiders entered the canyon, their movements slow and deliberate. They were a menacing, silent force, their faces a grim, predatory mask. They had them cornered. They had them trapped. Jed stood at the front of his group, his rifle raised, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "Turn back now," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You don't want to do this." The leader of the gang, a burly, bearded man with a cold, cruel look in his eyes, just laughed. "We've come too far, Jedediah. We're not turning back now. We want the girl, and we want the map. And we're not leaving without them." Jed's gaze was cold and unwavering. "You're not getting either of them," he said. "The girl's not here, and the map. The map's long gone." The leader's face contorted with anger. He had been tricked. He had been outsmarted. He raised his rifle, his finger on the trigger. "Then you're a dead man, Jedediah." A shot echoed through the canyon, and the leader fell, a silent, dark heap on the ground. Jed looked at the source of the shot. It was Gus. Gus, who had been a silent, unassuming presence, was a deadly, precise marksman. The gang, stunned by the sudden turn of events, just stared at them. Jed seized the moment. "Get out of here now," he said, his voice filled with a cold, chilling authority. "And don't ever come back, or I'll find you, and I'll kill every last one of you." The gang, their leader dead, their bravado shattered, just stared at him. They were defeated. They were broken. They turned, and they rode, a silent, defeated force. Jed and his men just stood there, their bodies trembling with relief. They had won. They had faced a dangerous, ruthless gang, and they had won. They had done the impossible. They had saved Elara's family. They had kept their promise. The journey back to the ranch was a long, slow and joyous thing. The sun was a warm, comforting presence in the sky, the air a gentle, soothing breeze. They were a small, victorious group, their hearts filled with a quiet, peaceful contentment. Jed rode at the front, his face a rare, peaceful thing. He had done it. He had faced the dangers of the land, the hostility of his men, and the ghosts of his past. And he had won. He had kept his promise, and he had brought them home. Elara, who had been watching from the front porch, saw them first. She saw the small, weary group of riders, their bodies a blur against the horizon. She saw Jed at the front, his body a familiar, comforting silhouette. And she saw her parents, their faces a mixture of weariness and joy. She ran towards them, her body a blur of motion. She ran into her mother's arms, her face buried in her chest, her body a trembling mess of relief and joy. "Mama," she whispered, her voice a choked, emotional sound. "Papa, you're home." Thomas and Sarah held her tight, their faces a mixture of tears and laughter. "We're home, baby," Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion. "We're home because of Jed." Elara looked at Jed, her eyes filled with a deep, silent gratitude. She walked to him, and she wrapped her arms around him, her small body trembling with emotion. "You did it," she whispered. "You brought them home. You saved us." Jed just stood there, his body stiff, his mind reeling. He had never been hugged before, not like this, not with such a pure, unadulterated love. He didn't know what to do. He just stood there, his arms at his sides, his face a mask of bewildered shock. But then he slowly, carefully wrapped his arms around her, his embrace a clumsy but genuine thing. He held her tight, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He had faced a ruthless gang. He had stared death in the face. But this was the most terrifying, the most beautiful, the most overwhelming thing he had ever experienced. He had promised to protect her. He had promised to save her family. And he had done it. He had kept his promise. And in doing so, he had found something he never knew he was looking for. A family, a home, a reason to fight, a reason to live. He was no longer just a man who ran a ranch. He was a man who had found his purpose, and he would not let it go. The days that followed were a testament to the quiet power of healing. Elara's parents, Thomas and Sarah, were a silent, grateful presence on the ranch. They were gaunt and weary, their bodies worn thin by fear and captivity, but their eyes held a light that had long been extinguished. They were a quiet, unobtrusive family, their movements slow and deliberate, their gratitude a tangible, humbling thing. Jed, meanwhile, was a man of action, but he was also a man of quiet observation. He watched them, a silent sentinel, a watchful guardian. He saw the way Elara would sit with them, her hands holding theirs, a silent, loving presence. He saw the way they would look at her, their eyes filled with a deep, silent gratitude for the daughter who had saved them, for the man who had brought them home. The ranch, once a place of rugged masculinity and harsh pragmatism, was now a home. The men who had once been so hostile were now a part of this new, fragile family. They would smile at Elara's parents, their faces a little awkward, but their intentions clear. They had fought for them, they had risked their lives for them, and they had won. They were a part of something bigger now, something more profound than a ranch, more important than gold. Jed, however, was still a man of the land. He returned to his routine, his days filled with the rhythm of ranch life. He rode the perimeter, he checked on the cattle, he managed his men. But his mind was always on Elara and her family. He would find himself riding past their cabin, a silent, watchful shadow in the morning light. He would see them sitting on the porch, a quiet, peaceful tableau, a sight that filled him with a quiet, unshakable contentment. One evening, Jed found Thomas sitting on the porch, staring at the vast, empty plains. Jed sat down beside him, the silence a comfortable, familiar thing between them. "How are you doing, Thomas?" Jed asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Thomas just sighed, a long, weary sound. "I'm alive, Jedediah. That's more than I thought I'd be. I owe you everything." Jed just shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing. I just did what was right." "No," Thomas said, his voice firm. "You did more than that. You risked your life for us. You risked your men's lives. For what? For a stranger's family." Jed didn't have an answer for him. He just shrugged. "I made a promise. I kept it." "Why?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with a quiet, persistent curiosity. "Why did you do it? Who are you, Jedediah Stone?" Jed just looked at him, his face a silent, impenetrable mask. "I'm a man who keeps his word." He knew that was not the whole answer. He knew he had done it for Elara, for the girl who had howled like a wolf, for the girl who had a fierce, quiet courage, for the girl who had found her voice again. He had done it for her, and for the family she so desperately wanted. But he couldn't say that. He was a man of action, not of words. He was a man who showed his loyalty, not a man who spoke of it. He just sat there, in the quiet of the evening, a silent, reassuring presence. Thomas, meanwhile, just looked at him, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew he was a man of few words, a man of quiet courage, a man who would do the right thing, even when it was the hard thing. He knew that he owed him a debt that could never be repaid. They sat in silence. Two men, two strangers bound by a shared experience, a shared debt, and a shared gratitude. The sun set, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. The air turned cold. Jed rose and he went back to his cabin, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had done the right thing, he had rescued them, he had brought them home. But he knew the journey wasn't over. He knew the past was a living thing, a shadow that still clung to them. He knew they had to find a way to let it go, and he knew he had to help them. The peace on the ranch was a fragile, temporary thing. Jed knew it wouldn't last. The Red Creek Raiders, even without their leader, were a dangerous, persistent force. He had to be prepared. He had to be ready for the inevitable retaliation. He spent his days training his men, turning them from ranchers into a small, well-oiled fighting machine. He taught them how to shoot, how to fight, how to survive. He was a hard taskmaster, his face a grim, unyielding mask of discipline. The men who had once been so hostile now respected him. They saw his quiet, unwavering resolve, and they knew he was preparing them for a fight. Elara, meanwhile, was a constant presence in his life. She would bring him food. She would sit with him while he ate. She would talk to him about her day. She would talk about the ranch, about the chickens, about the flowers that were beginning to bloom. Her voice, once a reedy, unused whisper, was now a soft, melodic thing, a sound that filled him with a quiet, unshakable contentment. She was slowly, tentatively, beginning to open up to him. She would ask him questions about his life, about his past. He would answer, his words clipped and to the point. He was not a man who spoke about his past. It was a dark, private thing, a part of him he had long buried. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, she asked him a question that hit a little too close to home. "Jed," she said, her voice soft, why do you live here, all alone? Don't you have a family?" Jed's face stiffened. He looked out at the vast empty plains, his eyes a distant, faraway thing. I did," he said, his voice a little rough. "My ma and pa, they're gone. And my sister, she left, a long time ago." "Why?" Elara asked, her voice a soft, gentle thing. Jed just shook his head. She didn't like the life here. She wanted more. She wanted to see the world. He didn't tell her the whole truth. He didn't tell her that he had failed to protect her. He had been a young, hot-headed boy, more interested in chasing golden glory than in protecting his own family. He had let her go. He had let her go to a world that was cruel and unforgiving. He had failed, and the guilt, a dark, heavy thing, had been his constant companion ever since. Elara, sensing his pain, didn't push it. She just reached out and she gently took his hand. Her touch, a small, fragile thing, was a powerful, comforting presence. She didn't need to say anything. She just sat there, her hand in his, a silent, powerful gesture of empathy and understanding. Jed just sat there, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He had been a man of solitude, a man who had built walls around his heart, a man who had sworn never to let anyone in. But with Elara, the walls were beginning to crumble. He was beginning to feel again, to hope again, to love again. It was a dangerous, terrifying thing. But it was also the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. He had rescued her, but she, in turn, had rescued him. She had saved him from a life of quiet, lonely desperation, and he knew he would never be able to repay her for it. Jed's act of heroism, his quiet courage, had not gone unnoticed. Thomas and Sarah, his parents, were a constant presence on the ranch, their gratitude a quiet, humbling thing. They were a family of quiet strength, of deep-seated loyalty, a family who had been through so much and had come out on the other side. One afternoon, Jed found Thomas in the barn, his face a grim, determined mask. "Jedediah," he said, his voice a low, serious thing. "I want to talk to you." Jed just nodded. He knew what was coming. He knew they wanted to repay him. He had seen the way they looked at him, their eyes filled with a quiet, unshakable gratitude. "Jedediah," Thomas said, his voice firm, "we owe you. We owe you our lives. We owe you Elara's life, and we want to repay you." Jed just shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing. I told you that." "No," Thomas said, his voice a low, persistent rumble. "You don't understand. We're a family of prospectors, Jedediah. We've been looking for gold our whole lives, and we found it." Jed's heart sank. He knew where this was going. He didn't want the gold. He wanted a life, a quiet, peaceful life. He didn't want the riches, the fame, the endless conflict that came with it. "The map," Thomas said, his voice filled with a quiet, triumphant pride. "The map the Red Creek Raiders were after. It wasn't a map to a treasure. It was a map to a mine. A gold mine. A mine so rich it could set a man up for life." Jed's face was a mask of stoic indifference. "I don't want it, Thomas. I'm a rancher. I don't need gold. But it's a way to repay you," Thomas said, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "It's a way to say thank you. It's a way to make up for all the pain we've caused you." Jed just sighed. He saw the desperate need in the man's eyes, the deep-seated need to repay the debt, to make things right. He knew he couldn't refuse him. It was a matter of honor, of pride. He had to accept it. "All right, Thomas," he said, his voice a weary, defeated thing. "I'll take it. But I'm not going to use it. I'm going to put it away. For a rainy day." Thomas's face lit up. He reached into his satchel, a small, worn bag he had carried with him everywhere, and he pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a map, a crude, hand-drawn thing, but it was a testament to a life of hard work, of quiet determination, of a dream that was so close to being a reality. Jed took the map, and he folded it, and he put it in his pocket, a silent, weighty thing. He knew he would never use it. He had everything he needed. He had a ranch, he had his men, he had a new, fragile family. He had a quiet, peaceful life. He didn't need gold. He needed a home, and he had found it. Jed knew that the peace on the ranch was a fragile, temporary thing. He knew that the Red Creek Raiders, even without their leader, would be back. They were a force of nature, a force of greed and hatred. He had to be prepared. He had to be ready for the inevitable retaliation. He spent his days training his men, turning them into a small, well-oiled fighting machine. He taught them how to shoot, how to fight, how to survive. He was a hard taskmaster, his face a grim, unyielding mask of discipline. The men, who had once been so hostile, now respected him. They saw his quiet, unwavering resolve, and they knew he was preparing them for a fight. He also spent his days with Elara and her family. He would sit with them at dinner, a silent, comforting presence. He would listen to their stories, their voices a quiet, melodic thing, a sound that filled him with a quiet, unshakable contentment. He was learning to be a part of a family again, a part of a quiet, loving unit. It was a strange, new thing for him, a thing he had long sworn he would never have. But with Elara, with her family, he was beginning to see the value in it. He was beginning to see the value in a life that was more than just work, more than just survival. One evening he found Elara sitting by the fire, her face a quiet, thoughtful thing. "Jed," she said, her voice soft, I want to learn." Jed looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. "Learn what?" "Everything," she said, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. "I want to learn how to read. I want to learn how to write. I want to learn about the world. I don't want to be a ghost anymore. I want to be a person." Jed's heart swelled. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, the deep-seated need for knowledge, for a life that was more than just a memory of fear and pain. "I'll teach you," he said, his voice a quiet, unwavering promise. "I'll teach you everything I know." And so, every evening after the work was done, he would sit with her by the fire. He would teach her how to read, her small, trembling hand tracing the letters on the page. He would teach her how to write, her fingers a little clumsy at first, but soon gaining a practiced ease. He would talk to her about the world, about the cities, about the mountains, about the vast, empty oceans. He would share with her the stories from his own life, stories he had long kept to himself. He was not just a teacher, he was a guide. He was leading her out of the darkness, out of the silent, lonely world she had lived in for so long. He was giving her the tools to build a new life, a life that was not defined by her past, but by her future. And in doing so, he was building a new life for himself. He was no longer a man of solitude, a man of quiet desperation. He was a man with a purpose, a man with a future, a man with a new, fragile but beautiful family. The peace on the ranch was shattered one evening by the sound of gunfire. It was a sharp, sudden thing, a sound that cut through the quiet of the night like a knife. Jed, who had been sitting with Elara, was on his feet in an instant, his hand on his pistol, his face a grim, determined mask. He ran to the front of the ranch, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw them. A group of riders, a small, determined force, their faces grim, their rifles raised. It was the Red Creek Raiders. They had come back. They were a different kind of force now. They were no longer a drunken, celebrating mob. They were a cold, calculating force, their movements a silent, deadly thing. They had come back to finish what they had started. Jed and his men took their positions, their rifles raised, their faces grim. They were ready. They had been preparing for this moment. They were no longer a group of ranchers. They were a small, well-oiled fighting machine. The leader of the group, a cold, calculating man with a scar running down his face, rode forward. "Jedediah Stone," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You've been a fool. You should have let us go. You should have given us the girl and the map, but you didn't. And now you're going to pay." Jed just stood there, his rifle raised, his eyes unwavering. "You're a long way from home," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And you're a dead man." The two men stared at each other, their gazes a silent, deadly thing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind. The air was thick with tension, with a silent, palpable hatred. The leader gave a signal, and his men charged, their movements a blur in the darkness. Jed and his men fired, the sound of the shots echoing through the quiet night. The battle was a short, brutal thing, a symphony of bullets and death. Jed was a quiet, deadly force. He moved with a silent, lethal grace, his rifle a part of him, an extension of his will. He was a predator, a hunter, a man who had faced death so many times he no longer feared it. The Red Creek Raiders were a silent, defeated force. They were outmatched, outgunned, and outsmarted. They fell one by one, their bodies a silent, dark heap on the ground. The battle was over. The fight was won. Jed walked through the aftermath, his face a grim, tired mask. He looked at the bodies, the silent, defeated faces of the men who had wanted to take his home, his family, his life. He felt no triumph, no joy, just a deep, abiding sadness, the sadness of a man who had to kill to protect what was his. He returned to his cabin, his body weary, his spirit worn. He found Elara waiting for him, her face pale with fear. She ran to him, and she wrapped her arms around him, her body a trembling mess of relief and love. "Jed," she whispered, her voice a choked, emotional sound. "You're safe. You're safe." Jed just held her, his arms wrapped around her, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He had won the battle, but he knew the war was far from over. He knew the ghosts of his past would continue to haunt him, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had a new, fragile but beautiful family. He had a home, and he had a reason to fight. He would face the darkness, he would face the danger, and he would face the ghosts of his past, and he would do it for her. The battle was over. The Red Creek Raiders were a defeated, broken force. Their leader was dead, their men were gone, and their reign of terror was over. The peace on the ranch was a quiet, profound thing, a peace that was born of a deep, abiding sense of security and a quiet, unshakable courage. Jed, however, was a man of quiet reflection. He walked through the aftermath of the battle, his face a grim, tired mask. He saw the bodies, the silent, defeated faces of the men who had wanted to take his home, his family, his life. He felt no triumph, no joy, just a deep, abiding sadness. The sadness of a man who had to kill to protect what was his. He returned to his cabin, his body weary, his spirit worn. He found Elara waiting for him, her face a quiet, thoughtful thing. She just looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, silent gratitude. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He knew what she was thinking. He sat down beside her, his body a tired, weary thing. "It's over," he said, his voice a low, tired rumble. "They're gone." She just nodded. She reached out and she gently took his hand. Her touch, a small, fragile thing, was a powerful, comforting presence. She didn't need to say anything. She just sat there, her hand in his, a silent, powerful gesture of empathy and understanding. Jed just sat there, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He had been a man of solitude, a man who had built walls around his heart, a man who had sworn never to let anyone in. But with Elara, the walls were beginning to crumble. He was beginning to feel again, to hope again, to love again. It was a dangerous, terrifying thing. But it was also the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. He looked at her, this small, fragile girl who had so unexpectedly come into his life and changed everything. She was a testament to the power of resilience, to the quiet, unwavering courage of the human spirit. She was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. He took a deep, shaky breath, and the words, "a quiet, simple, powerful thing," came tumbling out. "Elara," he said, his voice a low, nervous rumble, I'm a man of few words, a man who doesn't know how to say these things, but I've been thinking." She just looked at him, her eyes wide with a quiet, curious anticipation. I've been a lonely man for a long time," he said, his voice a little rough. "I've been a man who didn't think he needed anyone, but with you, I'm not lonely anymore, and I don't want to be. I want to be with you, always." He reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it, and he pulled out a simple silver ring, a small, elegant thing that had been in his family for generations. "Elara," he said, his voice a quiet, powerful thing. I want to ask you something. I want to ask you to marry me. I want you to be my wife. I want you to be a part of my life, for always." Elara's eyes filled with tears. She looked at the ring, then at him, her face a mask of silent, profound emotion. She had been a ghost, a lost, broken girl, a creature of the night. But with Jed she had found her voice, she had found her family, she had found her home, and now she had found her heart. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just nodded, her face a quiet, joyous thing. She took the ring, and she slipped it on her finger, a silent, powerful promise of a future that was hers. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, silent gratitude. "Yes," she whispered, her voice a reedy, unused sound. "Yes, Jed, I will, for always." Jed just smiled, a rare and genuine thing, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He had faced a ruthless gang, he had stared death in the face. But this was the most terrifying, the most beautiful, the most overwhelming thing he had ever experienced. He was no longer a man of solitude, a man of quiet desperation. He was a man with a future. He was a man with a wife. He was a man with a home, and he would not let it go. The news spread through the ranch like wildfire. Jedediah Stone, the cold, stoic rancher, was getting married. The men who had been so stoic, so pragmatic, were a mix of emotions. Some were bewildered, some were a little annoyed, and some were secretly pleased. They had seen the way Elara had brought light back into Jed's life, and they knew it was a good thing. The wedding was a small, quiet, and beautiful thing. It was a testament to a different kind of love, a love that was born not of passion, but of quiet strength, of deep-seated loyalty, of a shared history of pain, and a shared future of hope. Thomas, with tears in his eyes, gave Elara away. Sarah, her face a quiet, beautiful thing, stood beside her, her hand in hers. Gus, his face a rare, joyous thing, stood beside Jed, a silent, unwavering presence. The men, dressed in their Sunday best, stood in a quiet, respectful circle, their faces a mixture of wonder and respect. Jed, dressed in his finest suit, stood tall, his face a grim, determined mask. But as he looked at Elara, his face softened. She was dressed in a simple white dress, a beautiful, delicate thing that had been made for her by Sarah. Her hair, a soft brown thing, was braided with wildflowers. She was a beautiful, ethereal presence, a ghost who had found her way back to the world of the living. The ceremony was a short, simple thing, a quiet vow, a gentle kiss, a silent promise. And then they were married. They were husband and wife. Jed looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, silent love. He had found his soulmate, his partner, his wife. He had found his home. He had found the one thing he had long sworn he would never have. The party that followed was a boisterous, joyous thing. The men, once so quiet, were a loud, celebrating mob. They ate, they drank, they danced. They were a family, a group of quiet, stoic men who had found a new, beautiful thing in their lives. Jed and Elara sat together, their hands in each other's, their hearts filled with a quiet, profound contentment. They had faced so much. They had endured so much. But they had come out on the other side. They had found their way back to each other, and they had found a new, beautiful thing in their lives. The sun set, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. The air turned cold. Jed wrapped his arm around her, and he held her tight, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He had faced a ruthless gang, he had stared death in the face, but this was the most terrifying, the most beautiful, the most overwhelming thing he had ever experienced. He was no longer a man of solitude, a man of quiet desperation. He was a man with a wife. He was a man with a home. He was a man with a future, and he would not let it go. The gold mine, the source of so much pain and so much greed, was a silent, empty thing. Jed and Elara, along with Thomas and Sarah, stood at the entrance, their faces a mixture of awe and sadness. It was a place of ghosts, a place of broken dreams, a place of a family's legacy. Thomas, his face a quiet, determined thing, looked at Jed. "Jedediah," he said, his voice a low, serious thing. "This is our legacy. This is what we've been working for our whole lives. We want you to have it. It's a way to repay you. It's a way to say thank you." Jed just shook his head. "I told you, Thomas, I don't want it. I'm a rancher. I don't need gold. I have everything I need." "No," Thomas said, his voice a low, persistent rumble. "You don't understand. This isn't just a mine. It's a family. It's a new beginning. It's a way to build a new life, a life that's not defined by the past but by the future." Jed looked at Elara, her eyes filled with a deep, silent hope. He knew he couldn't refuse them. It was a matter of honor, of pride. He had to accept it. "All right, Thomas," he said, his voice a weary, defeated thing. "I'll take it, but I'm not going to use it. I'm going to put it away. For a rainy day." Thomas's face lit up. He reached into his satchel, a small worn bag he had carried with him everywhere, and he pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was a map, a crude, hand-drawn thing, but it was a testament to a life of hard work, of quiet determination, of a dream that was so close to being a reality. Jed took the map and he folded it, and he put it in his pocket, a silent, weighty thing. He knew he would never use it. He had everything he needed. He had a ranch, he had his men, he had a new, fragile family. He had a quiet, peaceful life. He didn't need gold. He needed a home, and he had found it. The peace that had settled over Jed's ranch was not the quiet stillness of an empty valley, but the profound calm of a land that had weathered a storm. The Red Creek Raiders were a bitter memory, a ghost laid to rest by steel and resolve. Jed found himself watching the horizon less, his grip on his rifle less tight. He was learning slowly and awkwardly to be a husband, a son-in-law, a pillar of a family he had never asked for, but now cherished with a fierce, possessive love. He and Elara had settled into a rhythm, one built on silent understanding and quiet strength. She had taken to her new life with a grace that amazed him. She no longer flinched at loud noises, and the wild, primal fear in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, contented light. Jed had taught her to ride, to shoot, to mend a fence. She was a quick and eager student, her movements gaining a new kind of confidence with every passing day. He watched her from afar, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Her parents, Thomas and Sarah, were an integral part of this new world. Thomas, a wiry man with hands calloused from a lifetime of prospecting, now found purpose in the soil. He had a natural understanding of the land, an ability to coax life from the dry earth that Jed, for all his ranching experience, had never seen. He had started a small garden, a riot of green and color that stood as a vibrant testament to a life rebuilt. Sarah, a woman with a gentle spirit and a kind smile, became the heart of their home. She taught Elara to cook and sew with a quiet patience, her presence a balm on the wounds of the past. Their family, once scattered and broken, was whole again. But the past, as Jed knew, was a tenacious thing. It didn't simply vanish with a final bullet. It left behind fragments, lingering echoes in the quiet moments of the day. For Elara, the trauma was a well that ran deep, and it was in those moments of solitude that she still struggled with the lingering shadows. One afternoon, Jed found her sitting on the edge of the creek, her body tense, her eyes a distant, troubled thing. She was humming a soft, sorrowful tune he had never heard before. He sat down beside her, his presence a quiet, solid anchor. He didn't speak, just waited. He had learned that with Elara, silence was often a more powerful language than words. After a long moment, she looked at him, her eyes filled with a raw vulnerability. I dream about them, she whispered, her voice a reedy, unused sound. The man who found me, the one who hurt me. Jed's jaw tightened. Elias. No, she said, shaking her head. Not him. The other one, the one who made me howl. He liked to listen. He said it made him feel powerful. She shivered, her body trembling with a sudden, overwhelming fear. He was a silent man. I never heard him speak. He just watched. He always watched. Jed's hands clenched into fists. A different man. A ghost he hadn't accounted for. Elias had told him everything, or so he thought. He had spoken of the Red Creek Raiders and their leaders, but he hadn't mentioned this man, a predator who took a perverse pleasure in her suffering, a different kind of evil. I don't know his name, she continued, a tear rolling down her cheek. I just remember his eyes. They were like a snake's, cold, dead. He called me his little wolf. He said he would find me again, that no matter how far I ran, he would always be watching. The fear in her voice was a palpable thing, a living, breathing creature. Jed's promise to her, a vow of protection, felt inadequate in the face of this deeply personal terror. This wasn't a gang, a faceless force he could fight with a rifle and strategy. This was a personal demon, a ghost from her past that was still haunting her. He won't find you here, Jed said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. You're safe. I won't let anyone hurt you. Not again. She just looked at him, her eyes filled with a fragile hope. He knew his words weren't enough. He knew she needed proof. He needed to show her that her fear was unfounded, that her tormentor was nothing but a memory. Over the next few days, Jed's quiet vigilance returned. He watched the horizon, his senses on high alert. He rode the perimeter of his land, his eyes scanning every shadow, every rock formation. He found nothing. No sign of a strange horse, no footprints, no sign of a fire. The world was quiet. The sun was warm. The ranch was at peace. But the ghost remained. Jed saw it in the way Elara would startle at a sudden sound, the way she would look over her shoulder, a silent, persistent fear in her eyes. He knew he had to do something. He had to face this ghost. He had to lay it to rest once and for all. He had to find the man with the snake's eyes. He had to kill him. Not for the gold, not for the ranch, but for Elara, for her peace, for their future. Jed had always been a man of quiet authority, but now his every move was laced with a desperate urgency. He knew the ghost from Elara's past was real. The man with the snake's eyes was not a figment of her imagination. He was a living, breathing threat. And Jed knew that if he didn't find him, he would find them. The thought filled him with a cold, burning rage. He wouldn't allow this quiet terror to take root in their new life. He confided in Gus, his loyal foreman, and now his closest friend. Gus listened intently, his face a grim, determined mask. "We'll find him, Jed," he said, his voice a low growl. "We'll find the bastard and put him in the ground where he belongs." But Jed knew this wasn't a job for the entire ranch. This was personal. This was a hunt. He was a predator, and this man was his prey. He needed to be silent, to be a shadow. He needed to ride out alone. He told Elara his plan. He found her in the garden, her hands in the soil, her face a quiet, peaceful thing. "I'm riding out," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "I'm going to find him, the man you told me about." Elara's hands stilled. Her face went pale. The wild, primal fear returned to her eyes. "No, Jed," she said, her voice a soft, desperate whisper. "Please. He's a ghost. You can't fight a ghost." "He's not a ghost," Jed said, his voice firm. "He's a man, and he's a coward. He preys on the weak, but he's not preying on you anymore." and I'm going to make sure he never does again. But what if something happens to you? She said, tears welling in her eyes. What if he's waiting for you? What if it's a trap? Jed just shook his head. I'll be fine. I'm a man who knows how to survive. You just stay here, you stay safe, you stay with your family, I'll be back. But she didn't just stand by and watch him go. Her quiet courage, the fierce resilience he had come to love, rose to the surface. No, she said, her voice a little stronger now. I'm going with you. Jed's face stiffened. Elara, this is too dangerous. I'm not bringing you with me. It's too risky. It's my past, Jed, she said, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. My ghost. I have to face him. I have to be the one to lay him to rest. I can't live a life of peace and quiet if I know he's still out there. I won't be able to sleep. I won't be able to breathe. I have to face him. With you. Jed looked at her, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unyielding resolve in her face. He had saved her once, but she was no longer a victim. She was a partner, an equal. She was a woman who would not be defined by her past. He knew he couldn't stop her. He had a choice. He could leave her behind and risk her living a life of fear, or he could take her with him and face the danger together. He knew what he had to do. All right, he said, his voice a low, defeated rumble. You can come, but you follow my lead. You do exactly what I tell you. You don't speak. You don't move. You don't breathe unless I tell you to. Is that understood? She just nodded, her face a grim, determined mask. I understand. Jed went to the barn and saddled up 2 horses. He packed a few supplies, a rifle, a pistol, and a few days' worth of food. He told Gus he was riding out for a few days, a quiet lie that Gus, to his credit, saw right through. Gus just nodded, his face a silent, worried thing. Be careful, Jed, he said, his voice a low growl. Bring her back safe. Jed and Elara rode out as the sun was setting, their silhouettes a silent, determined thing against the vast, empty plains. They were on a long, dangerous journey, a journey into the heart of a conflict that was not their own. But they were together. They were a team, a small, determined force against a ghost from the past, and in that moment Elara knew that her fear was gone. She was with Jed, and with him, she was not just safe. She was powerful. She was a force to be reckoned with. The ghost from her past was a man, and she was going to face him, and she was going to win. They rode for 3 days, their journey a silent, determined thing. Jed, his senses on high alert, led the way. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a hunter. His instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of hard living, were a silent, lethal guide. He found the trail on the 2nd day, a small, almost imperceptible thing, a trail left by a lone rider, the man with the snake's eyes, the man who had been watching. They followed the trail to a remote, treacherous canyon, a place of jagged rocks and sharp shadows, a perfect place for a man to hide. It was a place of isolation, a place where a man could be a predator, a man who could watch and wait and strike when his prey was most vulnerable. Jed and Elara dismounted, their movements silent, their faces grim. They moved through the canyon, their bodies a part of the shadows. They found him in a small hidden cave, a place of darkness and isolation. He was a silent, gaunt figure, his face a grim, twisted mask. He was alone. He looked at them, his eyes a cold, unblinking thing, filled with a look of surprise and a chilling, predatory hunger. My little wolf, he said, his voice a low, rasping whisper, the first words she had ever heard him speak. You came back to me, just like I said you would. Jed's hand was on his pistol, his face a grim, determined mask. It's over, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. You're done. You're going to pay for what you did to her. The man just smiled, a chilling, humorless thing. Did you think I was just waiting for you? He said, his voice filled with a mocking cruelty. Did you think I was a fool? I knew you'd come. I knew you'd bring her to me. I've been waiting. I've been watching. And now it's over for you, Jedediah Stone. Jed's heart sank. He had walked into a trap. He had been so focused on finding the man, he hadn't considered the possibility that the man was waiting for him. He had been a fool. The man pulled a small hidden lever, and a net, a large, crude thing, fell from the ceiling, trapping Jed and Elara. It was a trap, a simple but effective thing. Jed was a powerful man, a man who could fight a whole gang, but he was no match for a net. He was tangled, his movements restricted, his rifle useless. The man with the snake's eyes approached them, his face a grim, triumphant mask. He pulled out a knife, a long, sharp thing, and he held it to Jed's throat. "Now," he said, his voice a chilling, venomous whisper. "Now I'm going to kill you, right in front of your little wolf." Elara's heart pounded in her chest. She was a survivor, a woman who had faced so much. But now she was trapped. Her husband, the man who had saved her, the man who had given her a new life, was about to die. But in that moment, she was not afraid. She was not a victim. She was a fighter. She looked at Jed, his eyes filled with a quiet, unyielding defiance. She looked at the man, his eyes filled with a triumphant, predatory hunger, and she knew what she had to do. She had learned from Jed, from a life of quiet observation. She had learned to be a survivor. She had learned to be a hunter. She looked at the man, her eyes filled with a deep, silent rage. She let out a sound, a long, mournful, primal thing, a sound that was a mix of a wolf's howl and a woman's scream. It was the sound that had haunted her, the sound that had defined her. But now it was a weapon. It was a silent, powerful thing that was filled with a lifetime of pain and a fierce, unyielding courage. The man was startled. He flinched, his hand trembling, his concentration broken. And in that moment, Jed acted. He was a man of quiet, unyielding strength. He used all his power, all his force, to rip the net apart. He was a force of nature, a man who could not be contained. He grabbed the man's arm, and he twisted, and he slammed him against the wall of the cave. The man fell, a silent, dark heap on the ground. Jed, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and relief, just stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elara ran to him, and she wrapped her arms around him, her body a trembling mess of relief and love. "Jed," she whispered, her voice a choked, emotional sound. "You're safe. You're safe." Jed just held her, his arms wrapped around her, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He had won the battle. He had defeated the last ghost from her past. He had kept his promise. He had saved her. But she, in turn, had saved him. She had faced her fear. She had faced her past. And she had won. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior. She was a survivor. She was a part of him, and he was a part of her. He was a man with a future. He was a man with a wife. He was a man with a home. He was a man with a legacy of love, and he would not let it go. The journey back to the ranch was not just a physical return, but a spiritual one. The sun, a warm, comforting presence in the sky, seemed to have been waiting for them. Its golden light was not just an end to the day, but a blessing on their victory. A gentle, soothing breeze carried the scent of sagebrush and new beginnings, a stark contrast to the dust and tension of the past weeks. They rode slowly, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of quiet gratitude. Jed, Elara, Thomas, and Sarah were a small, victorious group, their hearts no longer burdened by fear but filled with a profound, peaceful contentment. The ghost of Elara's past, the man with the snake's eyes, was gone, his malice extinguished. The trauma that had once defined her existence had been confronted and defeated. The past was now a closed book, a memory to be recalled not with terror, but as a testament to their strength. They were free, their freedom earned through courage, trust, and a love that had proven stronger than any darkness. As the ranch came into view, it was more than a collection of buildings. It was a beacon of light against the vast, empty horizon. It was a place where a man who had built walls had learned to build a home. It was a place of love, a sanctuary of peace, a haven for a family that had been scattered and was now whole. They were a family, a small, fragile, but beautiful thing. Jed, the stoic protector, Elara, the resilient soul who had found her voice, her parents, Thomas and Sarah, who had found a new life where they thought none was left, and the men who had become their family, bound by a shared battle and a deep, unspoken loyalty. Their very existence was a testament to the power of resilience, to the quiet, unwavering courage of the human spirit. They had faced down a relentless, murderous force, and in doing so they had discovered a strength they never knew they possessed. Jed, now a husband and a partner in every sense of the word, was no longer a man of solitude. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long had vanished, replaced by a deep sense of belonging. He was a man with a purpose, his future now inextricably linked to the well-being and happiness of the family he had built. He had learned to love, to trust, to open his heart to a world he had long sworn he would never enter. The old Jedediah Stone, The man of stone, carved from the rock of the land he owned, had softened, not into weakness, but into a more profound, more powerful version of himself. He had built his life, not just on his own strength and cold logic, but on the enduring love and unshakable loyalty of the people who had become his family. Every fence mended, every head of cattle counted, every sunset watched from the porch held a new, deeper meaning because he was no longer doing it for himself alone. The change in the ranch was most visible in the men. Silas, a shadow of his former self, no longer harbored the bitter resentment that had once defined him. He had seen the way Jed had fought, not for acclaim or a profit, but for the life of a single, defenseless woman. He had seen the quiet courage, the unyielding resolve, and the deep, abiding love that had driven their boss to do the impossible. The mockery and hostility had been replaced by a grudging respect, and over time, a genuine admiration. Silas, a man who had only ever seen the darkness and the greed in the world, had witnessed a light so powerful it had burned away his cynicism. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a part of the ranch now, a part of the family, a man who had seen the darkness and had learned to appreciate the light. He found a new purpose in his work, not just as labor, but as a contribution to the peace and prosperity of a place he had once scorned. He was no longer just an employee, he was a silent guardian of the new order. The gold mine, the very source of so much pain and so much greed, was a silent, empty thing. The map that had caused so much suffering now sat in Jed's desk drawer, a testament to a dark chapter that was finally over. Jed and Elara, along with Thomas and Sarah, held a family meeting. They didn't want the gold, they didn't need the riches. They had everything they needed in each other. The gold was a symbol of the past, a symbol of a life of greed and of loneliness. It had brought only conflict and sorrow. They decided to sell the claim. They would use the money to build a new life, a life that was not defined by their past but by their future. The money would be a fresh start, a clean slate, a tangible representation of their shared victory over adversity. It was a powerful act of defiance against the very forces that had tried to destroy them. The gold would not be a source of conflict, but of shared prosperity. With the money from the claim, they built a new, beautiful house on a rise overlooking the creek. It was larger than the old one, with wide porches and big windows that let in the sunlight. It was a house filled with a quiet, profound love, its foundation not laid with bricks and mortar alone, but with trust, courage, and a deep, abiding love. The garden Thomas and Sarah had started blossomed into a vibrant, sprawling thing, a beautiful symbol of new life and growth. The ranch, once a place of hard labor, was now a true home, a living testament to the power of resilience and the quiet, unwavering courage of the human spirit. The love that had brought them all together was woven into the very fabric of the house, in the warmth of the fire on a cold night, in the scent of Sarah's cooking, in the sound of Elara's voice, now strong and clear and full of joy. Years passed, bringing with them the gentle rhythms of a peaceful life. Jed and Elara's love deepened with every season. The wild, fiery passion of their early days had settled into a profound, enduring partnership. They worked side by side, ran the ranch together, and stood as a united front against any new challenge that arose. Their greatest blessing came in the form of a son, a quiet, curious boy with his father's unwavering eyes and his mother's gentle, infectious smile. He was a testament to a love that was born not of whirlwind passion, but of quiet strength, of a deep-seated loyalty forged in fire, of a shared history of pain and a shared future of hope. He was a boy who would grow up in a world that was not defined by fear, but by the boundless, nurturing love of his family. He would never know the terrors that had shaped his parents, and that, more than anything, was Jed's greatest victory. The ranch was now a place of profound peace, a bastion of quiet, profound contentment. Jed and Elara would sit on the porch in the evenings, their hands in each other's, their hearts filled with a love that had grown so deep it no longer needed words. They would watch the sunset, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple, and they would listen to the sound of their son's laughter, a sound that filled them with a deep, unshakable joy. It was the sound of a life well lived, a promise kept and a future secured. Jed would look at her, this small, resilient woman who had come into his life as a broken, terrified girl and had changed everything. She was a testament to the power of love, to the quiet, unwavering courage of the human spirit. She was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. a hope that could be found in a stranger's kindness, in a quiet promise, and in a love that was stronger than any ghost from the past. She was a wife, a mother, a partner, a friend. She was his life, she was his love, she was his legacy, and he would not for anything in this world, let her go.